Conspiracy and Holocaust Distortion in Modern Russia and the West. Noah is at the Institute for the Study of Global Antisemitism and Policy. His areas of specialization include Holocaust memory, digital humanities, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Russian political memory. Noah?
Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Sher, for a very great introduction into what I'm going to present to you today. And thank you all for your perseverance into this final hour. I today will be presenting on historical distortion, specifically as it relates to World War II and the Holocaust, or what is referred to in Russia as the Great Fatherland War, or Great Patriotic War, which was alluded to yesterday by Dr. Grabowski. In May of 2023, north of 1 year after Russia's invasion into Ukraine, I published an article in the Journal of Genocide Research entitled "The Paradox of Genocide in Modern Russia: Evolving Narratives of the Siege of Leningrad," which centered on an October 2022 declaration, which you can read here, around contemporary discourse on the timing of the declaration, the political currency of genocide rhetoric and legal recourse, and finally tracing its origins back to the siege itself, which would transform Soviet war mythology and national identity for decades to come, its effects readily identified today. Whether in foreign policy measures, polemics, or in the plain clothes of cartoons, caricatures, and other means of civilian and state propaganda, which I will be showing you today as well. But rather than simply restating my initial thesis, I introduced this declaration in a longitudinal way since it was introduced to demonstrate the power of language in its presence and its absence. This statement makes mention of various wartime adversaries, as well as various accusations of the highest moral imperative, and this is very important. These mentions are effective because they position Russia as a victim, and victimhood sells, if you pardon my blunt diagnosis, and at a high premium. It does so despite Russia's ambivalent relationship to Holocaust memory and the memory of Germany's scorched earth Holocaust by bullets in the East, and so too because of its universalist anti-fascist commitment to a national memory of civilian suffering in World War II, which, importantly, tends to exclude Jews, if not Soviet Jews at the very least. In the current war in Ukraine, understanding itself at once a victim of genocide and the guardian of authentic anti-fascist Holocaust memory is a convenient position for Russia to take. Unlike some contemporary scholarship, which abandons the conceptual stretching of genocide in favor of new concepts, Russian authorities are combining their independent monumentalization of the siege with the monumental category of genocide as the crime of crimes. In doing so, they perversely and rhetorically underpin Russia's commission of international crimes against Ukrainians in the name of preventing them. Now, as ironic as it may be, you may recall that Russia's primary casus belli was a since falsified claim of genocide against ethnic Russians in the Ukrainian East. As early as 2015, if not earlier, not long after the occupation and annexation of Crimea, President Putin had this to say at Moscow's Jewish Museum and Tolerance Center on Holocaust Remembrance Day. He urged his audience to resist the violent nationalism of the Ukrainian and Baltic kind, which is based on the exact same ideology that made the Holocaust possible. More recently, on the 80th anniversary of the Soviet victory in Stalingrad, he had this to say about Germany's military aid to Ukraine. He said, "It is incredible, but it is a fact. We're being threatened again by German Leopard tanks with crosses painted on their armor, and once again they are going to war with Russia on Ukrainian soil with the hands of Hitler's followers." Again, paradoxically, everything here is a paradox. Russian political discourse about Ukraine has had much to say about President Zelensky's Jewishness, his Jewish friends, in quotes, and how Zelensky is, quote, a disgrace to the Jewish people, as Putin said in 2022, in June. A few months later, Putin would further this conspiratorial anti-Semitism by stating, quote, "Western curators have put a man, an ethnic Jew with Jewish roots, with Jewish ancestry, at the head of modern Ukraine. This makes the whole situation highly disgusting, in that an ethnic Jew is covering up the glorification of Nazism and covering up those who led the Holocaust in Ukraine in their time, end quote. In December of last year, responding in a press conference to a question about the future of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine, Putin claimed, and I quote, "These are people without any faith at all. Godless people. They are ethnic Jews, but who has seen them in a synagogue? I don't think anyone has seen them in a synagogue. They're kind of not Orthodox because they don't go to church either. They are certainly not followers of Islam because they hardly show up in mosques either. They are people without tribe and without family. They do not care about anything that is dear to us and the overwhelming part of the Ukrainian people." Vyacheslav Likhachev, the author of the recent report from which these quotes are drawn and for which I am most grateful, is correct in his assessment that the latter claim does an excellent job of reanimating such classical tropes of Jews as godless in the Stalinist tradition of rootless cosmopolitans. For more examples, I highly recommend the publication by the Union of the Council for Jews in the Former Soviet Union. An abridged commentary can be found in Moment magazine, which written by the president of the council, Paul Goldberg. Now, speaking of Holocaust Remembrance Day, as a brief aside, marking the Soviet liberation of Auschwitz on the 27th of January, 1945, this day used to be observed at the same time as the day of the lifting of the siege of Leningrad. However, in November 2021, the Russian Ministry of Education removed Holocaust Remembrance Day from the school calendar. Upon questioning from the Russian Jewish Congress, the ministry explained there was already a similar date, Memorial Date, the day of commemoration of the genocide of the Soviet people, very long names, on the 19th of April. While the government reinstated the memorial date the next year, again strangely timed, the ministry's explanation reveals the conflation or substitution of the genocide of Soviet Jews with that of the monolithic Soviet people, or peoples, excuse me. Despite initial withdrawal in 2023, Russia did dedicate a week of memorial events to the 27th of January when World War II veterans, Israeli parliament members, and Russian diplomats came together at the monument to the siege of Leningrad in Jerusalem to memorialize the Soviet losses to Nazi Germany as well as Soviet Jews who perished in the Holocaust, during which the Russian ambassador to Israel, Anatoly Viktorov, venerated the country's joint efforts in combating anti-Semitism and historical revisionism of Nazi crimes. They, quote, "do not have a statute of limitations and should not be forgotten." This stance positions Russia as the authentic protector of genocide memory and the liberator of fascist entities now and to come. Which brings us to the middle of the sandwich, so to speak, comprised not of one isolated incident, but of a multitude or a pattern of historical revisionism and distortion, which serves to justify Russia's current and future actions. The accusation of genocide is made retroactively on both Germany and Ukraine, not to mention the historic anti-Zionism of the former Soviet Union, which excludes and erases the suffering of Soviet Jews in the Red Army, and their memory. And in fact, it was Germany which, in 2008, recognized around 6,000 Jewish survivors of the siege and granted them a one-time reparation payment. Though notably, former residents of Leningrad and awardees for its defense during the siege were also granted payments by the Russian government in 2021. Note here, as Likhachev again correctly summarizes, quote, "state memory policy is built on the denial of the anti-Jewish character of the Holocaust." Moreover, the emphasis on Soviet victimhood as central to Russian political memory is intentionally overstated, even if it does have legitimate historical context. We know top Nazi leaders, including Hitler himself, campaigned with great zeal on the racial inferiority of the Slavs, the necessity of Soviet subordination, and the explicit premeditated starvation of Soviet civilians, including and especially in the siege of Leningrad. As many scholars have written, genocide has been historically construed as the crime of crimes, just as Jewish Holocaust victims are perceived as, quote, exemplary victims. The siege of Leningrad as genocide is perfectly reasonable, but it is weaponized when it becomes an exemplary crime to act on in the future. In his 2020 publication about the concurrence of the siege in the Holocaust, Alexander Dukov, director of the Historical Memory Foundation and a scholar in the Institute of History at the Russian Academy of Science, does just this, and in the form of an instructional and methodological module for educators. It marks the entrance of an innovative discourse, placing the two in parallel, treating them as separate events but possibly overlapping. Here we may be reminded of Raphael Lemkin's assertion that, quote, Jews and Slavs faced genocide during World War II. And he was the gentleman who invented the term genocide. To the credit of Dukov, who is, however, considered a revisionist historian and thus a controversial citation of which I am well aware, the threat of Jewish genocide nearly did reach Leningrad around the time the German army began the siege. Yitzhak Arad outlines the evidence of Einsatzgruppen active in the Leningrad region whose intentions were to reach city limits. In particular, Einsatzgruppe A, stationed their headquarters in Krasnogvardisk in October 1941, nearly 40 kilometers south of the city, and concentrated in the area of Army Group North. Quote, its final objective was Leningrad. And while there is no reason to believe their objective was reached, Arad specifies the activity of the murder squads leading up to the 17th of September capture of Pushkin, where a few kilometers south of Leningrad, the town's 250 Jews were rounded up in the town's palace, and buried in its gardens. Leningrad had been sealed off on the 8th of that month, and the Nazis' first extermination camp, Chelmno, would commence operations in December. And though it is not the job of historians to answer what if, perhaps we can take a moment to imagine what might have happened had the Wehrmacht and Einsatzgruppen had their way with the Soviet Union's second largest city, had they in fact defeated the Red Army. Of course, it bears reminding, since the media cycle moves as quickly as it does, that some actors in the West, and in some sense I do mean actors, have appropriated Russia's stance on certain matters and sympathize with their position so much so that, as it turns out, it was Ukraine who started the recent war. This is a obvious and blatant revisionism of the present, a distortion of history, albeit recent history, but no less integral to a broader analysis of Russia's political influence of pure anti-fascism. Now, in another perplexing and nonetheless ironic moment in this conflict, following the casual tweeting by then Secretary Antony Blinken, himself, by the way, subject to abundant anti-Semitic remarks by Russian commentators, St. Petersburg was declared a sister city to the previously besieged Mariupol, a site of genocidal violence in its own right. Here you can see gathered various officials at the ruins of the Donetsk theater, where around 600 Ukrainians of the 1,200 seeking refuge there were killed by a Russian airstrike in March of 2022. There to testify to the historical accuracy of the perversely symbolic relationship to the cities, was veteran State Duma deputy from left to right Dmitry Savlin, who was born in Ukraine, Donetsk People's Republic leader Denis Pushilin, St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov, and then Mayor of Mariupol Konstantin Ivashchenko. Now, before I conclude, I would leave you with some illustrations of substantive continuity, courtesy of my colleague Yehuda Harel Greenberg, who is doing very important work on the subject. The image at left is from June 2022, published in Donbass Today, and depicts President Zelensky shrugging in naive innocence, claiming, "What is fascism? We Ukro Jews are holy people." Ukro Jews, of course, is a normalized descriptor in modern discourse, and according to my colleague, it continues to circulate widely. Zelensky is donning the outfit of an angel, staged with a halo, a framed Ukrainian flag with a superimposed Star of David, and seems to be helping himself to some recreation in the shape of a swastika. I suppose it makes it more fun. The image at center is from Krokodil magazine in 1982, created by Naum Moisesevich Lisogorsky on the heels of the Lebanon War, and shows a Nazi skeleton manipulating the mouth of an Israeli soldier, speaking into the microphone of a seemingly pleased American journalist, the two parties standing atop corpses of what can be assumed to be Beirut civilians. The ghost of Nazi Germany exclaims, "Germany above all," while the Israeli puppet repeats the Nazi slogan, "But for Israel." Finally, the image at right, created by Joseph Vyacheslavovich Efimowski in 1973, going backwards, this time on the heels of the Yom Kippur War, demonstrates the epitome of the Jew as Nazi perversion, portraying an Israeli soldier with a Star of David armband and bayonet, bearing over an old Arab man within the confines of what can only be inferred to be a concentration camp. The cigarette-smoking soldier says, "We are for direct contact with the Arabs." The narrator, in return, says, "This was in fashion among the Nazis. Everyone remembers those damned years. And in Tel Aviv, they seem to have forgotten how the aggression ended then." To conclude, historical revisionism and Holocaust distortion, in particular, is central to exerting a national narrative, albeit indecisive, of both victor and victim, for which, as the scholar Alexander Etkind has written, mourning for the past is often connected to warning about the future. For the international left, whose historical and continued adoption of Soviet anti-Zionist tropes, as Isabella Tabarovsky has extensively shown us, the Jew as Nazi makes perfect sense in today's progressive binary framework of identity politics, and for whom the microcosm of inversion gradually careens into a macrocosm of anti-Semitism, all in the name of both soft and hard power, or perhaps better described as what Suzanne Nossel coined smart power in 2009, smart in its weaponization and sinister also in its weaponization. Thank you.